Hey everybody, we are back. Coming at you with another episode of The Forest and the Trees. My name is Jeremy, and I'm here with my friend Jeff.
The line separating good and evil passes not through podcast streams, but right through the human heart.
Does it?
Yes? We'll find out. We'll discuss. We're solving the answers to the universe on this episode, I think.
We are getting into a lot of kind of like basic human nature here, good and evil stuff that regardless of where you're coming at in your beliefs, I think we all kind of wonder this, like, hey, are we all doomed from the start, or is there hope, or what's going on? Which direction are we headed as society?
That's a very good question, Jeremy.
Today, we've got some fun topics. We're going to look at whether or not we focus too much on bad Christians. We're going to explore whether or not God can brag about God's self. If we are born good, or are we born little devils? And why our answer to that question matters immensely. All in one episode. And this is going to be fun, all in chapter 3. And I'm going to start us off with a little curveball for my friend Jeff. I'm not even going to let you ask your questions yet. I'm going to go guns a-blazing. I'm going to start with a question for you, because right off the bat, there's an interesting argument that Paul makes, and I want your take on Paul's argument here. And then I'm gonna spice up his argument with a Russian theologian, just to make it extra flavorful.
Awesome. Hit me.
So Romans 3, verses 3 through 4 say this: just because they were unfaithful, does that mean God will be unfaithful? Of course not. Even if everyone else is a liar, God is true. So Paul's talking about how sometimes we look at someone following something and we say, oh, that person is doing a bad job of it, therefore the thing that they're following must not be true. Obviously, this applies to Christians who aren't following Jesus in a way that draws people to Jesus. And so, Paul's argument is like, well, does that make God bad? No. And this reminds me of something Leo Tolstoy, the Russian theologian and author, once said. He said, attack me, I do this myself. But attack me rather than the path I follow, and which I point out to anyone who asks me where I think it lies. If I know the way home, and I am walking along it drunkenly, is it any less the right way because I am staggering from side to side? I like his argument quite a bit.
Yeah.
So basically, Tolstoy is like, yeah, we've all been there. Look, if I know the right way home and I'm walking that road, but I've had a few too many drinks, then you look at that guy and say, I'm not going to follow that guy. He's drunk. But what if I'm drunk and I am still walking the right way home? Does it cease to be the right way home just because I'm swerving from side to side? This is Tolstoy's take on Romans 3, if you will. I don't know if he had Romans 3 in mind, but you can see how these connect. So, Jeff, here's my question for you. Is it possible that you have focused too much on the drunk people walking the path, and you have overlooked the fact that the path actually leads the right way?
Yeah, great question. So I really like this analogy to sort of make sense of the human condition. The idea that maybe not just Christians, maybe all of us are kind of drunk, stumbling, confused, trying to find our way. Yeah, that checks out. And I wonder if just religion in general, or the variety of religions, are just one of many ways people are utilizing to try to find the way, like figure out what the meaning of life is, where they're going. And to answer your question in terms of the drunk people, I would say, I hope I'm not focusing too much on the drunk people. I know I certainly have got some digs in about like specific pastors, or like, American evangelical Christian culture. All of that stuff is very, very easy to criticize. And it's, we do it all the time for sure. And maybe they deserve it. But also it's very easy to defend those types of criticisms by saying, well, those are just people, these are flawed people. who make mistakes, but the Bible is the good stuff. Or, some, if you don't just agree with that, maybe just like, it's not about the people, it's not about the Bible, it's about God. So I would say what I'm trying to do with this podcast and with the way I'm crafting my questions, I'm trying to mostly interrogate the claims of the Bible, because that's something that bothers me, is I feel like the Bible has a lot of bad ideas in it, I suppose, that I want to ask questions about and try to figure out, is there a way to make sense of these and make them more palatable or make more sense, that kind of thing. And of course, you could also say, well, the Bible is written by man, the Bible is flawed. So if you want to say, the true way is God himself, then that's a very vague and hard to understand, hard to follow path, because God doesn't seem to speak very clearly. If he's lighting the way as we're all stumbling home, it's a very dim light as far as I can tell. So yeah, I hope not. I'm trying to focus on the text and not spend too much time criticizing the drunk people, even though it is very tempting and easy to do that sometimes. What do you think?
You got me thinking, because you made the point that aren't we all just, the drunk people walking along? And I think that there's something about, which we're going to get into, whether we're good or bad. But I think we can acknowledge, no one is walking any path perfectly. There is no one you could follow on any road you want to, take.
For sure.
That you would say that person is flawless, has no issues at all. Therefore, their path must absolutely be better. So if that's true, then this is what you just got me thinking. If we all are, drunkenly walking whatever path we're on, then the path seems to matter even more. Because if you're drunk, the only way you're going to get home is if you really know the path, and that path actually does lead where you need it to lead, right? So if you drop a drunk person in a city and they don't know where they are and say, get home, they're not going to be able to get home. Like they don't, there's no path they know of. So, that condition is going to make it even harder. But if you say, hey, this path is so, it so well, and it does actually lead where you need to go, that even when you're drunk, this path can make you home. It almost makes it even sweeter to me. And I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I don't know. What do you think? Can it even be better because it gets drunk people to where they're trying to go?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, I think that's what the quote is getting at, right? Is like, this is, if you want to say that the quote is about like the Bible or Christianity, or like, I don't know, just like the essential doctrines or something like that, right? It's this framework that can get you there no matter how imperfect, no matter how much you zig and zag on your way. Is that how you're interpreting the quote?
Well, this is going to come as a shock to you. I'm going to interpret the path as Jesus.
Oh, right.
So I know that you're going to be stunned by that.
Uh-huh.
So I would say, anyone who claims to follow Jesus, if we think of Jesus as the path, or a path at least, and I would be, anyone is going to follow Jesus imperfectly, right? So does having Jesus knowing that, hey, any path I'm going to go down, I'm going to swerve or zigzag, then I really, the path matters, because if you don't have a good path, you ain't getting home. Like you're going to be stuck.
Yeah. And in terms of, so we've talked about following Jesus before, in terms of like, what does that mean? Because some people say like, some Christians say like, oh, Jesus called me to move and take this job. And some Christians like pray to Jesus for direction and just hear nothing. So then what do you do? Yeah.
Well, I don't think it removes faith, Jeff. We still have we still have faith. We still have need for a podcast, because it's not going to be all figured out today in Romans 3. But I think, this is Paul's argument. Hey, just because some people were unfaithful or some people had issues. And truthfully, I would just say, I have lost, mentors of mine in ministry that are no longer in ministry because of moral failure. And, that's like that's a really hard thing. I can just speak for myself. That's a really hard thing to wrestle with, and there's one pastor in particular who fairly recently, a
Hmm.
lot came out. And this is a guy that had helped me work through some of my own theological questions and, was a source for me when it's like, hey, I'm stuck on this. How do I, work through it? And then everything I ever saw from him, he did look like Jesus. And, I had seen him out of the spotlight. Now, again, I'm not defending what he did or negating it. I'm just saying I wasn't aware of that version of him. And so I think there are, this is what I think Paul's saying is like, any path you follow, and I suppose you might have your heroes of atheism, Jeff. And what if you found out one of them was a total jerk, or
Yeah.
abused his wife or something? Like, you
Hmm.
would still want that path or that argument or the way he says it to be valid, even though you're saying, wow, this is an issue with the person.
That's interesting because I've definitely, of course, I'm aware of all kinds of like high profile, like pastors and Christian leaders who have had a fall from grace for some kind of moral failure. So that's, again, that is really obvious and easy to criticize those people. I would say I haven't seen a ton of that in my life. Like most of my family, a lot of my old friends are Christian, and they're all good people, and they seem to be like on a good path in life. They don't seem to be. Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of that kind of like moral failure in my own life to make me have a crisis of faith in that way. Would you say like just Christians in general, Christianity as a whole, do they seem to be better people than non-Christians morally? To kind of bring up the meager moral fruits argument. Do you know what I'm asking?
Yeah, I think the one stat that comes to mind and I don't have this off the top of my head, but I've read this numerous places. But like when it comes to like measuring generosity,
Mm-hmm.
which people can measure, these are real numbers of what groups of people give to what. I think all the stats, or at least the majority of them, would indicate that Christians, by and large, give more money to more causes, to try to improve things than any other group.
Yeah.
So I think there are indicators like that I would say, yeah, that's cool. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think if you follow Jesus, it should make you a more generous person holistically, right? So that would be an indicator I would want to see. Yeah, like I would want to see more generosity with Christians. The problem I think is that it's not like that across the board. You don't see every single, okay, sexuality is improved if you're a Christian. Like I wouldn't make
Mm-hmm.
that argument at all. So, you have some of these other ones where you go, well, maybe they're more generous, but they're not necessarily kinder, and they're not necessarily more loving, and they're not necessarily better examples with, how they pursue their sexuality.
Yeah.
And where I think this gets tricky too, and this is like we're talking like at a big level, but if you narrow this down even, when you talk about, okay, which subversions of Christianity, so like which version of Christianity now are we talking? There are certain Christians, and the way that they talk about God and the way they treat people, I look at them and say, I want nothing to do with your version of God.
Mm-hmm.
And that happens a lot where I'm looking at them like, holy cow, the way you treat people, like you must have a nasty version of Jesus. And the hard part is it's almost like that disproves what Paul's saying here, because, Paul was like, yeah, well, just because they treat people like that doesn't mean. But I do think, I think that Paul's argument can be true. And we can also make a general blanket statement that, ideas have consequences. If you believe bad things or false things or harmful things, then they can produce harmful, decisions that you're going to make in your life. And I think, what you believe matters, and what you believe about God matters, and it affects the way you live. But there is some tension here of none of us are going to perfectly articulate any path that we walk down. So I don't know. I don't know if we just have to agree to live in the tension or the messiness, or what we do with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think no matter what you believe, you have to, to some extent, agree that like the world is mysterious and we don't fully have the answers. Right? We're all kind of blindly going on faith in that sense.
Yeah.
Your stat about like donating more money. Do you know if that includes tithing or if that's over and above tithing to churches? If it includes tithing, then that wouldn't surprise me at all because Christians are kind of not required but pressured at least to give 10% to their churches.
I
So
think it's not just tithing,
okay,
but again, I'm not staring at those numbers, so
yeah,
I don't want to mislead anyone here. But I'll occasionally see some article written on, and it's truthfully, the reason it stands out is because there's not many like this.
Yeah.
Where it's just like, oh, Christians are actually doing a really good job. The generosity one seems to be one that I see from time to time of people going, look, Christians are actually giving to worthy causes, and I think it's more in these articles they're talking about outside of the church rather than just, because within the church would be a little self-serving.
Totally. But that's something I think about a lot for myself for sure. Cause I used to tithe regularly. I gave away 10% of my income to the church. And since, past few years, I no longer do that. And I do make donations to charities, but it's much less than 10% of my income, honestly. And that's something I've sort of been thinking about and challenging myself on of like, well, if I've already proved that I can live off of giving away 10% of my personal income to something. So what if all atheists, myself included, gave 10% of their income to charities they believed in? That'd be pretty radical.
Well, to go back to our last episode, what if you found a way to use 10% of your income for environmental issues?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Wow. All right.
Call it an atheist tithe.
You're hitting me where it hurts, Jeremy.
Hey, it's what you get to do when you ask the questions. You get to just go for it.
I've been called out. That's a good challenge. I'll check.
I've had my fun.
I'll check with my accountant and see what I can do. I've got a question for you. In verse 6, it says, "If God were not entirely fair, how would he be qualified to judge the world?" So I just want to call out, I think I'm taking this verse a little bit out of context for the way I'm asking, because the context is Paul is specifically talking about people who are trying to find some kind of loophole for like, what if I just sin more so I can get more grace? He talks about this a lot in the chapter, so that must have been a real problem with the Church of Rome here.
They were stoked to sin to show how good God is.
People just kept pushing like, come on, Paul, come on. The more I sin,
we're going to make God so good. Wait till he sees what I do on Friday night.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So just to acknowledge that, but I still think it speaks to this Christian idea that I think Paul talks about in Romans as well, of just the idea of like, of course God is fair and just because he's God. How could he not be? It reminds me of Genesis 18:25 when it says, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" And Isaiah 55:9, "So my ways are higher than your ways, my thoughts are higher than your thoughts." Basically, just this idea of like, you shouldn't question God. Also, the book of Job, where according to the story, Job did nothing wrong, right? He was righteous and without sin. All this bad stuff happened to him. And as far as I can tell, I would say the only sin that Job committed was the sin of daring to question God, because when he finally does get an audience with God at the end, God kind of rebukes him and says, "How dare you question me?" and doesn't actually answer his questions.
Okay, I have a different take on that.
Right. Yeah, I figured you might. But okay. One more thought about this whole, like, are we allowed to question God or not? Or like, what does that even mean because of the position he holds? It also reminds me of this question the atheists get about, if you knew that God were real, would you worship him? So I think this is a really tough question, because I think the answer is probably yes either way. Because I think, okay, if God looks like Jeremy's version of God, and he actually is very good and loving, and there's some explanation for all the suffering in the world and stuff, and he actually is a good person, then okay, maybe he is worthy of worship. But if God is more like the traditional fire and brimstone view, where you literally have to worship him, and if you refuse, you'll be tortured for eternity, then I gotta say, yeah, I would surrender out of a cowardly sense of self-preservation. But of course, God is not actually good in this scenario. He's a coercive tyrant, but you're not allowed to say that out loud if you want to get into heaven. All right, so all that to say, is God actually good, fair, and just, or does he just get to say that about himself because he's in charge?
That's a great question, and I agree with your logic there of, if God is good and you knew for a fact God was good, or, believed it with some sense of surety, I guess, then you would respond to that, which is, what I have. I do think God is real, and I'm not certain about it, but I'm confident enough in that to, pursue that. But also equally true, if God was as monstrous as some Christians portray him to be, I would not want to follow that God, but you're right. You would have some sense of like, well, this God holds the keys, so you might as well appease him. You know what I mean? Like, otherwise you suffer. Unless you really just decide, I'm going to make a point and be defiant to the end and spend my eternity burning so that I can give the middle finger to a, nasty version of a God, which
totally. Yeah. I would have respect for someone who was willing to
sure
make a statement like that. But yeah, right. I don't think I could do it.
Watch me burn.
Yeah.
So the problem with this question, or I think the challenge with this question, is it's a good question, is it's a little bit, and I've referred to this image a lot because I think you have to acknowledge this when you get to certain theological questions. It's a little bit like plugging an extension strip into itself. Like, look, this cable goes in here. Well, yeah, it does, but that's a circular loop, and there's no power to any of that. So, like, you can take an extension cord, plug it into itself, and it'll look, in one sense, like everything's working the way it should. But anybody who understands how an extension, cord works will go, no, you have to plug that into the wall to get an external, source of power, because it can't just be internal. And so I think you're acknowledging a flaw in the way many Christians talk about God is, God is fair and just. Why? Well, because the Bible says so.
Yeah.
Well, who wrote the Bible? Well, God did. So it's like, so God is all these things because God said God is all these things.
Exactly.
And fun fact, this reminds me of is one of my favorite verses, and not for its theological astuteness, just from the humor aspect. Numbers chapter 12. This is old. We're going to go Old Testament for a second here. Numbers 12, verse 3 says this. Now Moses was very humble, more humble than any other person on earth.
Right.
Jeff, do you know who most Christians would say wrote the book of Numbers?
Yeah. Traditionally, it's thought that Moses wrote the first 5 books, right? So he's writing about himself. Yeah.
Yes, I've always thought it's so funny. Like, now just hold on. Let me take a moment to just tell you about the story. Like, you got to understand, I'm very humble. I'm more humble than any other. Now again, I said it very tongue in cheek because I don't think Moses wrote the book of Numbers.
Because it also, spoiler alert, later in the story, Moses also writes about the death of Moses. So that's another problem.
That's a valid point.
Yeah.
So there's something else going on somewhere, right? At a minimum.
He might have had some help.
Yeah, he had a little assist somewhere. But that kind of reminds me of God saying, God is awesome. Because
exactly.
God said so, Now, so here's my answer. Is God, good and just? I believe that God is those things because that's the God I've actually encountered. So that's why I would say. So I'm not going to say because the Bible tells me so. I'm going to say no, because that's the version of God I've experienced. Now, say that differently. I use my experience with God to help me understand what these concepts even mean, right? So what does it mean to be just? What does it mean to be loving? What is it like? I actually get that from the sense that I've experienced in God that then helps me make sense of, oh, that's what that concept even means because I've experienced that through God, which is still somewhat circular, but it's less so because now rather than just saying I'm allowed God to say this about God, I'm going to say, God, you have to almost prove that to me, not quite that defiant, but, I have to see some of this or experience some of this. Then I will, start to apply that. And there's a German theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who I think makes this argument really well and says it in a very succinct way. Here's what he says. God is love. That is to say, not a human attitude, a conviction, or a deed, but God himself is love. Only he who knows God knows what love is. It is not the other way around. It is not that we, first of all, by nature, know what love is, and therefore know also what God is. No one knows God unless God reveals himself to him. And so no one knows what love is except in the self-revelation of God. Love, then, is the revelation of God, and the revelation of God is Jesus Christ. So here, Bonhoeffer seems to be making a similar argument that, hey, because we've seen Jesus, we can now say that's what love looks like. We're measuring that on this person of Jesus and what Jesus actually did, the example of the cross. That's what love looks like. We've seen it. And when you measure it to that, now you have some criteria to go off of and then measure love accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
So I would look at that and say, well, the cross to me is the ultimate definition of what does it really mean to be loving? And then I work, backward from there, which then it invites us to go, okay, well, what have we actually seen God to be revealed as? So if we don't just go, well, let's quote a verse, because again, that's great if you already believe God is like that, but that's circular if you don't.
Mm-hmm.
So what have we seen God to be revealed as? And, I hit it almost every single week on this podcast, and Bonhoeffer just mentioned it, but I think a Jesus-looking God is the most profoundly beautiful thing the world has ever seen. Period. End of sentence. So to me, the reason why I would attribute all these qualities to God, because I have not seen anything else that can even remotely rival the profound beauty of God looking like Jesus on the cross. That portrayal of God to me is the most compelling, beautiful, draw me in. Like I want to follow a God like that. I want to surrender my life to a God like that. And I want to become like a God like that. I want to emulate and allow that God, to shape me who I am. And all of that is because who I've seen, not just who God claims to be. Now, another quote here that I think is helpful. Okay, so God could have done this a lot of different ways. Mm-hmm. We have the Gospels, and we have, the text, and a lot of mystery there, as we talk about week in and week out, of God doesn't just say, here are the 10 things or whatever. But there's a couple guys, Hugh Halter and Matt Smay, said this in their book. Have you ever stopped to ponder, this is an interesting thought, how Jesus lived his first 30 years without drawing any attention to his divine nature? I don't know about you, but if I knew I was going to change the course of history, I'm sure it would have slipped out on occasion. I doubt I could have just lived a normal life, but Jesus did. He lived among people for 3 decades, developing the relational respect and trust of people in his community. Jesus lived out. He left heaven, lived among us. He listened and loved unconditionally with no strings attached. Which I also say, because of who we know Jesus to be, or how history has revealed him, how it has been passed on, from generation to generation. Again, that's a compelling version of God to me, that Jesus for 30 years lays low and he's God incarnate. And then suddenly it's like, all right, now's the time. Let's kick this into gear. Again, I need to make a compelling point. If that were me, I think I would do some cool things. And who knows? Maybe Jesus on the playground had a few tricks up his sleeve, like just kind of showing some of the kids of like, look, I can do stuff you can't do.
Yeah. Well, that seems like kind of a big statement to make with very little evidence, to just say, just because we have the Gospels don't really say anything before he turned 30, that, he must have done nothing scandalous before he turned 30. You know what I mean?
It's an argument out of omission.
Yeah, argument from silence, exactly.
Right.
Other than
I would
the start of him at the temple.
Correct.
Well, there's the infancy Gospel of Thomas, where he I think he strikes his friends dead and then resurrects them and stuff like that. And
he's just with a bird or something in Thomas, I think.
Yeah. Oh, I think he turns a piece of clay into a bird. Maybe I might be getting that backwards, but anyway. Yeah, and of course, there's all kinds of erotic fan fiction about the early life of Jesus and stuff. So we're all kind of free to speculate. What?
Sure,
mm-hmm.
But I don't disagree. It is an argument out of silence. I agree. However, we don't have a lot of that. You would think there would be maybe some more examples if this was something Jesus did all the time.
Yeah,
maybe not.
I've always thought of it as just for whatever reason, just his power didn't come to him almost. Though I guess the story of him at the temple shows that when he was 12, he had special wisdom or something. Because I always think, I feel like I've always was taught that the wedding at Cana was his first miracle, and he says to his mother, "My time has not yet come." So that's like the start of like he didn't have like Messiah powers before then or something like that, or maybe he wasn't fully aware of his mission. I don't know. I'm sure this is a whole other podcast.
So I see that a little differently. I would say he, the wedding in Cana, John 2, he knows he's got the power to do that. But I think he's saying when he says to his mom, "My time has not yet come," of if I do this, the countdown to the cross begins. I think
interesting.
It's like, my time has not yet come, because the moment I do what you're asking me to do, it's all gets kicked into motion. And it does. Literally that night, it gets kicked into motion. And that's an intriguing angle to understand. Like, he literally let his mom persuade him into starting.
Talk him into it.
Clock. Yeah. Which is kind of a fascinating concept to think about, as this is God, right? And she doesn't know this, but this is going to, 3 years down the road, lead to him on the cross.
That seems like that's a crazy trade-off then. Huge if true. So you're saying that he's willing to initiate the steps to his own execution just to keep a party going?
Well, one way to look at it.
Seems like high stake. Like would you agree to be murdered 3 years from now if we ran out of beers at the party? And what I'm saying?
Correct. To clarify, I think Jesus already knew that was coming. So Jesus knows.
He couldn't have just laid low like indefinitely.
Correct. Okay. He knows again, this is my take. I think Jesus knew why I'm here, what I'm here for, what I'm going to do. But I think he's also, there was a timing element to that. And, even like, especially with the Gospel of Mark, there's this idea of the messianic secret. Jesus will do something and say, "Don't tell anybody." And a lot of people read that. They're like, "What's he doing?" It's like, well, he's trying to essentially give himself more time, because he knows, like, once more people hear about this, the inevitable end of where this is going to happen. And so it looks like he's kind of navigating the timeline there. And so I don't think Jesus is saying, "Hey, I could skip this party trick and avoid the crucifixion." He knows this is where this is headed.
Yeah.
But I think he's just thinking, like, I don't know if I want to start it tonight at this party. And then she, persuades him. And again, remarkably, he's like, "Okay, let's do it." And what's fascinating is it's not, a lot of people I love, obviously for a number of reasons. We run a company called Communion Wine Co. So I gather people together around wine a lot. But I love this story because it makes so many Christians uncomfortable. And when you get into the details of this, but really, I think, Jesus is realizing, like, no, I'm going to start the clock here. And if you look at the end of the story, it doesn't say, and they all, drank the best wine of their lives and thought Jesus was great to invite to a party. No, that wasn't the conclusion. It says, John Litter says, and Jesus revealed his glory. Like, literally, the glory of God was revealed that night in that way, in the first time, first of like his tangible acts, of, being this kind of wandering rabbi that was messing everybody up. And so I think it's really fascinating. And again, regardless, like, for 30 years, he apparently wasn't turning water to wine that led anybody to really talk about anything like that. Because once he started, all bets were off. There's a whole bunch of things written about him. So yeah. I would say I think it's at least somewhat of an intriguing argument.
Did he let any other parties flop throughout his 20s?
Ooh, that's a good. Yeah, he's 25. He's like, not now, Mom.
Not yet.
I need to wait about 5 more years before I do this.
Yeah.
But that's a fascinating, like, even the thought of how did Jesus discover what he was capable of? Like, it's just fascinating.
Because there's just kind of the one verse of, like, he grew in strength and stature and knowledge or something like that, right? That's kind of,
grew in wisdom and in favor with God.
Right. Yeah.
Both interesting. Like, how does Jesus
it doesn't
grow in wisdom, which is interesting. And then how does he grow in favor with God? It's just like both.
Yeah, did God love him? Yeah, less before. That seems weird. Okay, yeah, we're really far off the topic, but this is a good conversation.
This is where it goes sometimes. All right, my last part of the answer to your original question.
Yeah,
I would say one of the most underrated arguments for the goodness of God is that God stoops down to meet people where they are at and allows them to attribute their sin onto God. I'm going to say that one more time. One of the most underrated arguments for the goodness of God is that God stoops down to meet people where they're at and allows them to attribute their sin onto God. This happens throughout all the Old Testament. It fully happens on the cross where God takes all of it, right? And I think it still happens today. I had a friend who listens to our podcast and was a little bit exasperated, I think, after the last episode, and was like, well, if I take your argument about, everything pointing to Jesus, then why would I even read the Old Testament? What's the purpose if we're just going to keep doing this?
Yeah.
And I understand that. I think it's an overreaction. And this is why. Because the Old Testament teaches us this is how God interacts with us. God always stoops down, meets us where we are, which implies limitations onto God, because God doesn't have those limitations. We do. And God allows that, which means if God allowed, the Israelites to view him in some awful ways in the Old Testament, that some of the junk that we have today that we attribute to God, I would equally say that's God stooping down and saying, hey, you can think this of me. I'll take your sin and your broken images because I want to be in relationship with you, all the while trying to pull us, closer and closer to what God actually looks like. And so that's why we read the Old Testament. We don't give it the final say, but it helps reinforce for us the kind of God we're working with here that then shows us how God's going to interact with us today. And to me, that's an incredible character trait for any portrayal of God to have. And I look at that and go, that's remarkable. And again, that's a God that I'm drawn to.
Yeah, like would you say it's almost like he's allowing us to see him as the bad guy, right? Like he's letting his reputation be tarnished.
Right. And if I were God,
he's playing the long game.
think I would. I'd be like, no, I'm not like that. You're wrong. Get someone else. Like get someone better to, write this about me. And God doesn't. Like God just meets people and takes on their baggage, takes on their sins. Like, all right, I want to be in a relationship with you. So here's what you're going to think about me. And again, this is what happens on the cross. Mm-hmm. This is who Jesus reveals. Like, hey, I'll take your sin. I'll take all your issues. I'll put it on myself. And I will reconcile this debt that, you have with evil and any claim that Satan has. I'll take it all. And that way you don't have to deal with this. And so to me, that is just so, so beautiful, especially when you think about an all-powerful God could do it any way, God wants. And that's the way God chooses to interact with people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I know I've complained about this before. It just seems weird, like the length discrepancy, right? Like if you're going to say the Old Testament is the flawed version of God and the Gospels are the good stuff, are the real version of God, like why is the Old Testament so much longer than the tiny section where we learn about Jesus?
That takes place over a much longer span of time.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Well, that's a very straightforward answer. Wow, I appreciate that.
I mean, truthfully, you have, depending on when you date all the New Testament books, give or take 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on if you attribute all of them to the original authors, or if you think, they had some assists in addition to Moses,
Sure.
But all of those are written in a very short amount of time compared to how long the Old Testament was written.
So who can know the heart of God, right? Is God good or bad? That's a tough question. So maybe we can figure out if people are good or bad, because that's a little bit more
that will be way easier.
Tangible. Yeah. So I think Paul seems to have his opinions. So I've got a smattering of verses from chapter 3 here. Verse 9, all people under the power of sin. In 10, he says, as the scriptures say, no one is righteous, not even one. 19, the entire world is guilty before God. 23, the first step on the Romans road. Everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard. So this is a little bit what I was talking about earlier with the grumpy Uncle Paul idea of, to me, it seems like this is kind of Paul's perspective on humanity. I have a little bit of a pet theory that maybe Paul's low view of humanity comes from a place of self-loathing. Like maybe he felt guilty for all of the murder and persecution that he had done earlier in life and was kind of projecting that onto his subjects. Interested to hear what you think about that. But anyway, I feel like this idea that we are broken, we are sinful, it is so essential to the idea of the gospel message. Some people ascribe original sin, like we're born guilty already because of Adam and Eve, which I know you've spoken against original sin before. So I'm curious what you think about that. I will say it has a little bit of a sense of salesmanship to me as well. Like the idea of like, if you're going to sell someone a vacuum, first you need to convince them that their carpets are really dirty. It's like when I think about the Romans Road, I sort of think about it as like a sales pitch. Like step 1, you are sinful. Step 2, you are in need of a savior. Step 3, pray this prayer, that kind of thing. Okay. Well, anyway, so a lot there, but my question, very simple, Jeremy, simple question. Are people basically good or basically evil?
Well, just to acknowledge, I think, the Romans Road has absolutely become a marketing technique, and the reason you feel that is because that's how it's been used. And you're absolutely right. Let me, what's the first step of selling someone something is you got to convince them they have a need that your product can fill. And this is, I think you make a great point. This is how we often convert someone or attempt to, right? I'm going to show you the need and show you, I've got the solution for you, and it is gimmicky and it's gross. And I think when you reduce God to a formula like this, it's going to have negative consequences. So let's just unpack that. If original sin is a thing, and that's the idea that, we're all born sinful because of the fall, or however you want to, because of Adam and Eve, or we inherited their sin, or however you want to. If original sin is a thing, then God sucks at making people.
Yeah.
Like, if all the people after Adam are born with sin and are born flawed, God as a creator needs to up his game. Like, you're not good at making people. Maybe try your hand at something else. Now, I say that tongue in cheek because I don't believe that God is like that. I just hear this argued all the time. And I wanted to say to people, do you not realize what you are communicating about your view of God? And you think God is really not a good communicator or good designer, creator. Now, where am I getting, my argument for this? Go back to the creation story. Okay, how did God make people? Well, okay, according to the text, Genesis 1:26. Then God said, let us make human beings in our image to be like us. Oh, okay. Well, so are we broken like God is broken? Are we born with sin like God is born with? Like, you know what I mean? And you start going, what does it mean then if we're made like God? Verse 27. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. We were made like God to be image bearers of God. So this idea of original sin to me is just logically ludicrous. How am I made like God in God's image to bear God's image in my life, in my body, in my existence? Oh, but also I was born with massive amounts of brokenness and sin. Well, which is it? Pick one. Either I'm made in God's image or I'm made with a whole bunch of junk and sin, but I don't see how it can be both. And I would even say, if we are inherently evil, we could also not be like God and be image bearers of a good looking God. So if we are all in just like our default setting, which is where most Christians want to go with this, our default setting is evil. And, Romans 3:23, it's like, I see this all the time. Well, you're going to have to pick. Either you're going to take Paul literally and you're going to supersede Paul over everything else we see, which is what people tend to do with this verse. Or we say, no, we think that actually like we're made in God's image. And that's what the text says. And we're made good. And, so you go, okay, well, if we're made good, how did we end up here? How do we have sin? How do we have this problem? And I'm glad you rhetorically asked that, Jeff, because we just need to add a little nuance here. And Paul's going to give it to us in this chapter. And yet I think most people miss it. Okay, so here's my argument. What if we actually believe that we are made in the image of God, the way that Genesis tells us, but we live in a sinful world that pressures us to sin? So both are true. We are made good in the image of God, like God, but we also exist in this world with a pressure of evil and a force of evil that acts upon us. Where do I get that? Romans chapter 3, verse 9. We have already shown that all people, Paul says, whether Jews or Gentiles, are under the power of sin. That is what it means to live in this fallen world. post the fall. So once humans have sinned, now Satan has a claim. Now Satan has, all these forces at work. And so, yeah, we live in that, but we start off made in the image of God, and then Satan tries to hijack that and get us over, to have a claim over us. And this is this whole thing, why the cross and why Jesus said, no, I'm going to erase this debt forever so that Satan no longer has this claim. It's this whole thing. And one of the analogies, and this falls short, as all analogies do, but might be helpful for someone, is to think about sin like a car crash. Now, you could say, okay, are any cars going to crash today? Probably. It's probably pretty likely. And I can say that I'm not omniscient. I don't know the future. I'm not God. I don't have God's powers. But I could say with, a strong amount of certainty, yeah, I think there will be a car crash today. Does it mean that you and your car are going to crash today? No. In fact, that would probably be unlikely. You could. I mean, it's definitely a possibility, but someone's going to crash. It's like, you can just say so
it's
is the world
inevitable?
Correct. So I think God can foresee, statistically, it's pretty likely that this is going to go this direction. Does it mean we were born already wired for sin? I don't think it does. And again, if it does, then something is off with us being made in the image of God. And so I think there's a nuance here that most Christians miss. And again, you don't need to beat me over the head with Romans 3:23, because I'll just come right back at you with Romans 3:9 and say, Paul is saying we live under the power of sin. So we can be born good. We can be born in the image of God and live under the power of sin. And both of those exist together.
Okay, great. So your answer is we're born good. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe Genesis, we are really made in the image of God.
Oh, nice. Beautiful. Yeah. Or I did a poll on our Instagram, which is
what were the results
in
of
agreement. That? We're at 67% basically good, 33%
Ooh.
basically evil.
All right, guys. Way to go.
Two-thirds of our
Makes me so proud.
social media followers are in agreement with you there. This is just kind of a personal pet peeve of mine, because I feel like I've seen so many different pastors, to criticize the drunk people again. I've seen so many pastors say, I can prove we're basically bad. Have you ever seen a baby? Have you ever seen a 2-year-old? They don't need to be taught to be selfish. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Yeah. Does that bother you as well, or do you feel like that's a good illustration? Because pastors love using that, and everybody loves it. It gets a laugh every single time.
Yeah, it bothers me.
Okay.
But here's what I would say. A 2-year-old is living in the same world under the same power of sin that an adult is.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, great, you made a cute little joke at a baby's expense. Now, do you think that baby's living in a different world than you're living in?
No. They're not saying the baby's different. They're saying the baby's the same as us, and they're saying the baby is like a microcosm for all of humanity. But
to use Romans 3:9, is the baby under the same power of sin as you are as an adult?
Yeah. So
we tend to think, well, no, they're a baby, and look at they're choosing to sin as a little baby. That's the point. They're the exception, and look, they still do the same thing we do. Well, yeah, they're the same. They're under the same power of sin into this world, but that baby was made in the image of God to be an image bearer of a good God. So if that is true, that baby also can't be born pre-wired for Satan, which is essentially the same argument. You don't have to teach, kids don't share on their own. It's I also have seen kids do some remarkably beautiful things that I also can't explain.
Totally.
Wow, that was an incredibly, my kids have done things to me that I have made me tear up and again, I think it's interesting. Jesus talks about a childlike faith. It's Jesus almost disproves this argument and how often he would bring kids to him and say, unless you have faith like this kid. Well, Jesus, don't you know that kid was born, with he has sin too. It's it just misses the point of Jesus is going, no, these kids understand what you have failed to understand. And I just think, I think we've got a quick laugh at that joke. I think it logically and theologically falls apart quickly.
Yeah, I agree. The implications are so dark. From
dark.
Pauline perspective, it was because the baby wants their bottle, that means they deserve to go to hell if they died from sudden infant death syndrome before they could pray the prayer. I know you don't agree with that with that theology.
I have met Christians though they would say, yeah,
hmm
pray over your kids so that nothing happens to them before they accept Jesus. And I'm like, you have such a sad view of God to me.
Yeah.
And again, those ideas have consequences because that shapes the way you treat those kids and talk to those kids. And man, growing up with that mentality is going to do a number on you.
Speaking of growing up with that mentality, perfect segue, Jeremy. So all of this stuff about this low view of humanity, it got me thinking a lot about ideas of religious trauma, people who are raised in a certain branch, certain persuasion of Christianity, who are taught that they're worthless, that they can do no good apart from Christ, that they deserve to go to hell by default, and it's caused all kinds of psychological damage for people. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because I feel like this is a sales pitch that people use of like, first you need to convince people they're bad, and first convince them that they're dirty, and then sell them the way that they can clean up. So what do you think that it's worth all of this psychological damage that we've done to young people as a church?
Hell no. I think
nice.
This is one of the most harmful things in Christianity today. And one of the saddest realities is this is preached so often in the local church setting. And I hear it so often. And we wonder why we have self-esteem issues. We wonder why, in the church that people are, breaking apart, marriages are breaking apart. It's like you're telling people week after week how awful they are and thinking that's not going to have some type of consequence, And again, essentially what we tell people is you are garbage, but God can make you worth something. Isn't that good news? Like, no, you told me I was garbage. No. And if week after week I'm told I'm garbage, but God makes me good, you're garbage, but God makes you good. You're garbage, but God makes you good. I mean, at what point do you start to believe I'm garbage? Like that's really what I am. And the moment I have a faith question or a faith issue or a faith dilemma, now I'm just, I don't know if God loves me anymore because I really am garbage. I mean, like this is what happens. And I sit with these stories. I sit with, people who say this and they go, yeah, this messed me up. And it just breaks my heart because we don't have to communicate God like this. And in fact, I think it's an abuse of what we find in the scriptures. I understand where people get it. I just think, gosh, it's not honoring to God, and it's not honoring to the image bearers that God has made. And there's even a phrase for this. I don't know where it first originated, but it's been called pond scum theology, or some version therein. And again, this is so dominant in Christianity that most Christians who attend a church will go, oh yeah, I hear that all the time. I didn't know it. Rachel Held Evans talked about this once. She said, pond scum theology makes even less sense in the context of the Gospels. To believe that people are inherently worthless to God strips the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection of all their meaning and power. I love this line. It makes Jesus look like a fool for dying for us. And then a great line. If we are the garbage that we keep getting told we are, then Jesus, you gave up your life for garbage. Like you made the bad deal to trade everything you did for people like us. You should have found some better part of creation. It makes Jesus look like a fool for dying for us, and it leaves behind his followers with little incentive to seek out and celebrate the good in one another. And that is exactly what we see in so much of Christianity today. No, we're going to focus on sin. We're going to focus on all the nasty parts. Why would I celebrate something good? And in fact, I have found that if you try to celebrate the goodness in people, you usually get Romans 3:23 quoted at you. Like that's the sad irony of this chapter. Is like that verse, I've gotten that quoted at me so many times when I try to make any kind of argument or celebrate what I would say is the inherent goodness of God's image bearers. acting according to what we were designed to do. No, don't you know? Romans 3:23. And I'll say two final things on this point. Here's why I don't think this has any merit. Number one, Jesus didn't treat people who were far from God as if they were pond scum without him. That is not how Jesus treated people in the Gospels. He didn't say to them, hey, look, you're far from God. You're a social outcast. You're marginalized. I'm not even going to give you the time of day because you don't know who God is and you're not. I mean, he just didn't treat people like that. And in fact, the scandal of Jesus' ministry was he attracted all the wrong people. And it was the religious leaders constantly saying, how dare you bring these people in? They don't belong, because they were the ones drawn to Jesus. He did not treat them like pond scum, and then they just had to be cleaned up by Jesus. That's just not how Jesus treated people. And secondly, excuse me, I'm getting choked up on this one. I think that we've collectively accepted the scum theology. You ready for this? Mm-hmm. So we don't feel bad about God sending a bunch of people to hell.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, we're garbage, so we deserve it. It all of a sudden makes total sense to have an eternal conscious torment view of God, that God is going to make people suffer for eternity. And yeah, I can make way more sense of that if we're all garbage to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the only way you can make sense of that traditional view of hell, right? Is like if humanity is just bad by default, because otherwise, you could say, okay, I can see why Hitler deserves to go to hell, but why does an innocent child deserve to go to hell? And it's, it only makes sense if you can say just humanity is bad by default, as far as I can tell. Yeah.
Right. Otherwise, you have to say, if you want the traditional view of hell, you'd have to say God is sending a whole bunch of image bearers of God to hell for eternity.
Yeah.
Which is like, oof.
Which I feel like they would say, again, it would be fun to get a more conservative Christian on the show at some point, so they can.
Would it?
I think so, because it's too easy for the two of us to just pounce on them. They
pounce on me the rest of the week, Jeff. Speak for yourself.
Okay. Well,
they're in all my comments and mentions. I hear from them regularly. This is my oasis. This is my moment. Just to talk about the goodness of Jesus.
This is our own little chill.
Take this from me.
Our own little chill corner. All right, strike it from the record. Never mind. You're uninvited, Theo Bros. All right. So just one more question to go back to what I was saying about, like, I'm trying to interrogate the scriptures here, because again, like, it's so easy to just like call out conservative Christians who are harsh, but you could say, well, they have a flawed view of scripture or something. I don't know. And of course, it's impossible for me to like separate my reading of Romans in 2023 from the way it was always taught to me growing up and all that stuff. But I don't know. I still feel like just a straight reading of Romans out of context. It'd be interesting to hear from someone who just read it, who wasn't exposed to Christian culture before. I feel like Paul himself has this low view of humanity, like I was talking about before. Do you disagree with that? Do you think Paul is more chill than I'm giving him credit for?
I don't disagree. I actually think you're onto something there. And you see this with some of the early church fathers. I think it was Augustine, if I recall, who had like a ton of sexual sin in his life. And that was like a real issue for him. And so he felt disgusted with his own sexual drive, essentially. And so a lot of what he came up with, a lot of, his theology and his way of understanding God was almost an overreaction to his own disgust in his life of like, why do I have this and why can I not move past it? And I think you see some of that in Paul. Like, yeah, I think Paul had to work through quite a bit. I mean, to go from you're killing Christians one day to you're the world's best evangelist the next, like, yeah, awesome. Great story. But, I think there's some psychological damage there that Paul probably could have used a therapist to talk through of like, wow, okay, so I'm dealing with some feelings of guilt or shame or, remorse or regret or, whatever, like any human would. It doesn't negate how God used him and that God transformed him, but it doesn't mean he ceased to be the person he was overnight. Like there's some remnant of that. And, that was his story. And so I absolutely think you're right on, which is why, to go back to the very first episode, the setup to this book of Romans,
Mm-hmm.
this is why we cannot elevate Paul and make him appear to Jesus. Like Paul's got to be underneath Jesus, and all this has to be pointed through the person of Jesus, or else you allow, Paul's humanity to, I think, have more weight than it should. We should view this as God using Paul and Paul's story and Paul's baggage, because again, this is what Jesus does, stoops down to meet us where we are. And Jesus even did it with Paul.
Yeah, that's well said. Wow. That's making me think about just the topic of like the question of what is the gospel, Like I would say when I was younger, I would say like the gospel basically is the Romans road. Like you could explain all the tenets just in Romans. And then I don't know, when I became a more progressive Christian, I thought of it like, no, the gospel is just the story of Jesus' life. So it's just the story of Jesus walking around Jerusalem and healing people and teaching, and then eventually being crucified and resurrecting. And then Paul is just like commentary after the fact. Yeah, I don't. That is that good theology? What do you think about that?
I mean, I think in a nutshell, I would say the gospel is the good news of the person of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And so, well, what's good about it? Well, let me introduce you to Jesus, and I think you'll start to see why it's good news. You know what I mean? Because I'll start, number one, explaining what the Gospels reveal him to be, but then also inviting you to experience Jesus today. And, that all that is good news to me. And again, going back to, I really think a Jesus looking God is profoundly beautiful and profoundly good. And so that is good news, especially when you live in a world that wants to believe all these other things. And then, you have this view of Jesus emerge, and it's like, holy cow, I want that.
I certainly like it, like like I said earlier in the episode, like your view of God is much more palatable and more appealing to me than, I don't know, than views of God that I've been taught in other places. So yeah, it's cool. That's a hopeful note to end on, I think.
It's only taken me about 40 years to get to this place. So there you go.
Yeah. Do you think that that's a natural thing? Like it's natural to start with a more, I don't know, like a more conservative, more hellfire and brimstone view? Or is that just a product of the evangelical culture we were raised with?
I think it's more a product of the culture. I think what's interesting is, I've known, and this is where I go back to just experience rather than, some theoretical verse or theoretical argument.
Mm-hmm.
I've known people who, were raised conservative and then became progressive. I've known people who were raised progressive and then became conservative. I've known people that were raised conservative and stayed conservative. I know people that were raised progressive and stay progressive. Like I've seen it all. Like I've met people and their stories all over the place. So I don't think there's any necessarily like this is the trajectory most people go on. I think there is definitely dominant views in a culture. So if you were raised in that culture, these were the dominant views you were given. So I think there's definitely that. And I would say there's a lot of people, and this is the whole deconstructing conversation. Right. There's a lot of people who grew up with a lot of the stuff that you and I grew up with that are now going, that is not helpful. And this is hurt. And I gotta figure something else out other than that. And so I do think because we were all raised in it, it was such a prevalent, theology, such a prevalent, understanding of God. But I think what's cool is I would say, and I'm hopeful of this, is that I believe one of the things 10, 20 years from now that collectively will not have the hold that it currently does is the traditional view of hell. Mm-hmm. I think more and more people are going to go, yeah, that's a medieval concept that the church under Constantine came up with to coerce people to do what they wanted. Like that is not actually what, makes sense with Jesus. And I would love to see that happen. But I think there is some element of you're raised in something. And I think I tell my kids this all the time, like you can ask me what I think the right answers are to this stuff, and I'll tell you. But as you get older, you're going to have to wrestle with if that still makes sense to you. And I tell them this now, they're like, Dad, it'll always make sense. And I'm like, okay, you can say that now, but it may not to you. And, I said, you're going to have to decide what you believe. And I said, we as a family follow Jesus, but when you become an adult, if that's not something you choose to do, like that's your choice, you know, and I'm not going to make you or try to make you. You're going to have to wrestle with whether Jesus still makes sense to you. And so I think that everybody goes through that. And I think the hope would be that you don't have the same faith you had when you were a child. You know, we talk about like Noah's Ark and stuff. Like, well, Noah's Ark when you're a kid is a fun little story. There should come a point you read Noah's Ark and go, that's horrific, right? Like there's an element of you grew up a little bit, and I think all of us should have that. The sad reality is there's a lot of Christians who still think Noah's Ark's a beautiful fairy tale, and like, oh, that's so cool that God made the rainbow. It's like, wait, what? Like, I think you need to reread it as an adult and try harder.
Yeah, or think that that like even though it seems bad to our human minds that you're not allowed to question God, like I was talking about earlier. So like it must be good because God did it, and everything God does is good.
Yeah, a lot of people believe that. But again, that's why I think that lacks a whole bunch of nuance.
Yeah,
because then all the horrific things we find in the Old Testament, then somehow we have to explain it as that's God's goodness.
Yeah.
Genocide was God's goodness in the Old Testament. It's like, wait, what?
Well, that is something that I really appreciate about you, Jeremy, by the way, is the fact that like I come to you with all these questions, and I don't think once you've played the my ways are higher than your ways card on me, which I think, you know, is kind of a standard way to answer any tough questions about the character of God or Christianity or anything. So, you know, I appreciate that this podcast is a safe space for asking questions, or at least I hope so.
Well, I don't disagree with the logic of that text. Yes, God's thinking is far above mine. However, I think to your point, the way that gets used is a cop-out, you know, when it's like I'm backed into a corner that logically makes no sense. And that's why I think if what I believe is true, let's wrestle it out and logically try to see if we can still make sense of this. And I think you can. I just think it takes some work and willingness to sit with some doubt. And, you know, what I've learned is there are people that really love certainty and are not interested in doubts and don't like the way that feels. And so they don't spend time there. And I think it's healthy, you know, work this stuff through. This is why we have a podcast like this, because you're going to hear a whole bunch of ideas. And some of it, maybe you go, I've never thought about that before. And, you know, I love hearing from you each week, Jeff. Like, oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I could totally see why you know, and I don't know. I just think hopefully this is modeling, I think, where all of us should be living, where you're constantly working this stuff through and not like, oh, I figured this out when I was 12. And now I'm just going to ride that into the sunset. Like, good luck with that.
Yeah. I like that. I like that idea of always questioning things, always wrestling, always kind of re-examining what we believe and why. Appreciate you answering my questions. As always, Jeremy, thanks for not playing that card. You know, I think if you ever play that card, I mean, the podcast is over. So,
wow,
so
you're still so hostile.
unless
we have it on record. I was just threatened.
Unless we get to Isaiah, then you know, then we can talk about it because
Isaiah would be a fun book. Lots of God as mother in Isaiah. That would really get the Theo Bros going.
Yeah, totally. All right, well, that's the end of the episode. All right, talk to you guys later. Goodbye.